Hi, this is Will Logan. I'd like to introduce you to the sixth of our webinar series on climate-resistant water management approaches, adaptation in the age of uncertainty. And today the focus is on enhancing urban water resilience with some case studies from Latin America. And we'd like to begin with an opening statement by Miguel Doria, who is he is the what we at least used to call the regional hydrologist for UNESCO's Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, and works out of Montevideo, Uruguay. Miguel?
Good morning, and thank you very much, Will, and also Anil Mishra for the invitation to be here today with you and to share some thoughts on this topic of climate resilient water management approaches and adaptation in an age of uncertainty, with a special focus on urban water resilience in South America. And it's a very opportune theme. Well, first of all, because Latin America is the most urbanized region in the planet. The region currently have around 650 million people, and 80% of its population lives in cities. And it has several megacities with over 10 million inhabitants. So it's a very urbanized region, which in one hand, it brings some benefits in the sense that it makes it easier, for instance, to address some of the challenges due to population density, but on the other hand, also presents new challenges in the sense that the water resources are usually no longer concentrated where the population is. And I say this because when people think about South America, think about large basins like the Amazon basin, or wide estuaries like the Plata estuary, or big aquifers like the Guarani, but very often do not think about the Atacama Desert, which is also the largest non-polar desert in the planet. And so population is do not overlap with the water resources in the region, very urbanized, and there's big challenges there. Although in terms of supply, there was a very big effort in the last 2 or 3 decades to ensure that access to water was in place, and that was largely achieved, although there are still some issues, often on peri-urban areas, on rural areas. And even if access to water is largely enhanced, I would say, there are still very clear issues in terms, for instance, of frequency, in terms of water quality, in terms of vulnerable groups not having adequate access to enough water. And this is particularly evident now during the pandemic, because it is estimated that over 50 million people in the region do not have access to water to wash their hands, so water and soap. And this makes the control of the pandemic in certain parts of the region also a bit more complex. Now, climate change also brings another layer of complexity to this situation. And when we speak about climate change, we are speaking about increased frequency of droughts and floods. And this, unfortunately, is becoming very evident in some parts of the region, with a very strong impact, not only in the ecosystems, and that's a direct impact. And maybe I'll take this opportunity to recall that we are in a mega-rich region in relation to biodiversity, but also in a region where freshwater vertebrates are very, very likely being affected by high rates of extinction, and that's a big concern. But also big impact in terms of economics, in social terms also, and with implications to people. And its impact is felt, for instance, in internal migrations and international migrations, among other issues. Now, also on the Andean region, the climate change effect on glaciers is noteworthy. There's a very considerable loss of snow and ice mass, and this usually is mostly felt also during the dry seasons, because the glaciers tended to compensate for the loss of rainfall. And the tendency with time is actually for this situation to aggravate. And on the other hand, also there has been, particularly last year, a high increase on forest fires, very significant ones, which also has an impact on on sedimentation rates, erosion, water quality, the cost of water treatment. Anyway, so climate change usually has is having a significant impact, although there's lots of uncertainties still attached to it. In the Caribbean, well, although it's not strictly South America, even if South America has several islands, but in the Caribbean island states, there's also the impact of sea level rise with salination of groundwater, hurricanes, and other events also related with climate change. So in this context, there is really no alternative than to adapt, and to adapt in one hand to minimize the negative impacts of change, and on the other hand to try to seize on any positive impacts or opportunities that may be. And I already mentioned that uncertainty is a big layer of complexity in this context for the region, and knowledge, research, capacity building, it's the best tool that we have in this adaptation process. So we are supporting this knowledge development through several working groups, GWADI, ISI, IFI, among several others. Also, we have working groups focused on the Amazon basin, on La Plata basin. Forest systems is also playing a role in terms of reforestating river basins. Well, snow and ice, I think I already mentioned, and we are looking forward also today to listen the experiences of Bolivia and Ecuador, and I take this opportunity also to congratulate our colleagues José Luis Gutiérrez Ocio, Carlos Pedro Saavedra, Luis Dominguez Granda, and Mónica Menéndez, that we will listen with great attention. And last but not least, today also we have the meeting of the IHP national committees and focal points in the region is ongoing the entire week. And today we have the launching of a book where Anil Mishra also contributed very significantly about strategies to increase water availability during droughts and periods of water scarcity. So I also take this opportunity to invite you later on today to connect and participate in that book meeting, which also takes place in the context of the Open Sciences Forum of Latin America and the Caribbean, CILAC. So thank you very much, and congratulations also Will Logan for this, and Anil Mishra for this initiative, which I would say, unfortunately, of course, it's very timely and needed in this age of uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Miguel. We appreciate that. We know there's a conflict with your own meeting, so we appreciate that you took the time to be with us. And so with that, I just want to remind people that there is simultaneous interpretation, and that button is down at the bottom of your screen with the other buttons, or you can practice your second language as you wish. And with that, we will start with Jose Luis Gutierrez Ocio and the Bolivia project. And this is very interesting because it is with the in association with the German agency GIZ. Jose, he's a civil engineer. He's got a master's degree in photogrammetry and geographic information systems, and has been working on adaptation to climate change for quite a while now. And working, he's been training on scientific bases of climate change and different tools for adaptation. So again, the emphasis today is on Latin America, and it's on urban water resilience. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Jose.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen with you to begin with. The topic of my presentation is climate risk assessment at a river and basin scale using the GIZ methodology. This is a case study that we carried out in Bolivia. Bolivia is a developing country, and therefore it's vulnerable to global warming and its consequences. Adaptation to climate change is a strategy with the ultimate goal of avoiding harm and costs that can arise from doing business as usual without taking climate change into consideration. This case study is an example of adapting to the situation in order to generate the circumstances that will make it possible for development strategies to incorporate climate change as one of the factors. There are 4 parts to my presentation. At the beginning, I'll talk about the context for the assessment. Then I'll talk about the GIZ methodology. Following that, I will speak about the key aspects of this assessment. And I will conclude with sharing with you some of the lessons we've learned. Let's begin with the context of the assessment. Bolivia is in the central part of South America. It's considered to be a country that has a high availability of water. But unfortunately, the availability of water is not evenly distributed across the entire national territory. And in fact, there's one part of the country where water scarcity is a common problem. And in the other part of the country, water excess is a common problem. Now, the case studies are going to be focusing on river basins. And so I wanted to remind you this diagram that shows you river basin stressors. This applies not just to Bolivian rivers, but to all river basins. The first is population increase. There are also socioeconomic aspects that generate stress on the river basin. In the developing countries, poverty is one of these socioeconomic aspects, and it has a very important, plays a very important role. We also have ecosystem degradation. There can also be poor governance mechanisms that stress river basins. We also have excess use of natural resources, and then in addition to these river basin stressors, we can add now climate change that will play itself out in the river basins in notable increases or decreases in the available water resources in that river basin. So it's important to come up with an integrated management approach for river basins. Now in Bolivia, for these strategic river basins, we have a strategic river basin plan or a master plan. There are 5 steps involved in this in Bolivia. The first step is the preparation phase. That is when an institutional platform is developed. Following that, a diagnosis is carried out on the entire river basin, and that is the basis for the planning exercise, both in strategic terms and technical terms. And then in the 4th step, we can implement that planning process. And in the 5th phase, we'll adjust the program and the plan to bring it in line with the actual results. Climate risk assessment is something that is going to have to tie in with the Strategic River Basin Master Plan in 3 steps. First, in this diagnosis phase, that's where the climate risk assessment is going to give us an idea of those communities where there is a high risk of exposure to climate change. In the planning phase, climate risk assessment will suggest measures for adaptation to climate change. And then in the adjustment phase at the very end, climate risk assessments will provide additional data for the entire monitoring and evaluation process, which makes it possible to go back and feed into the next phase of the River Basin Plan. What's the methodology we use for this case study? We followed the methodology that is proposed by GIZ in its publication, Climate Risk Assessment for Ecosystem-Based Adaptation. This is a document that has been translated into several languages. It draws on 2 sources, IPCC and its work, and in particular, its 5th evaluation report in which it presents the risk model. And the other source of input, the other input is the methodology, which is started in 2016 with the vulnerability source book. So by using both of this, the entire methodology proposed by GIZ has become more robust. This model has, actually this approach has a conceptual model and a mathematical model. The conceptual model is the one that was drawn from the IPCC 5th assessment report, and where it's determined that the risk is something that reflects the existence of hazards or exposures or vulnerabilities. So there might be a hazard that's associated with something that comes from climate change. And that is something that constitutes a certain degree of vulnerability. The risk only exists when at the same time, there's also exposure to the hazard, there is the hazard, and there's vulnerability. Now, when all of that comes together in actual fact, we refer to it then as an impact. Now, when it comes to the mathematical model, we'll use the 4 components of the conceptual model of risk, drawing on indices for hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And each one of these factors is multiplied by a weighting factor. The GIZ's methodology comprises 9 steps or modules. It begins with module 1, preparing the risk assessment. After that, we will develop the scope and the objective of the evaluation, as well how a work plan will be developed. On the basis of that, then in module 2, an impact chain model will be developed. Now, what is this? This is simply a chain of cause and effect, where the main cause is a climate event, and the effect will be a potential impact on the entire river basin system. And in our case study, we'll be focusing on the specific river basin in Bolivia. On the basis of the cause and effect impact change, in step 3, we will identify and select the indicators for the different risk components, which are 3. Again, hazards, exposure, vulnerability. And then on the basis of this identification phase, we'll move on to step 4, where we have data acquisition and management of the data. In step 5, once we have all of the data in hand, we're still not in a position to include it for calculating the risk using the mathematical model. And that is because, as you can imagine, each one of the indicators will have a different scale and different units. So what we have to do is normalize the indicator data to make sure all of these scales can be converted into a single scale of 0 to 1, and assigned units to each one of the indicators. And once that is complete, we can move on to step 6, where we have the weighting and aggregating of the indicators for each one of the risk components. this enables us in step 7 to calculate the aggregate risk for each one of the communities that are part of the system. And on the basis of those outputs, we can interpret the outcomes of the risk assessment, and that gives us the basis for identifying the various adaptation options we have before us. So what are the key aspects of this assessment? First, the objective. The objective was to identify and quantify the climate risk at river basin scale in 2 rivers, Guadalquivir and Acero. The scope, one was for the present from the year 1980 to 2018 using historical data. And there's another time frame, which is the future, where we've been using forecasts, including the forecasts from the climate change hypotheses and scenarios. There were 2 hazards we focused on: water scarcity on the one hand and water excess on the other. This assessment focused on the following exposed elements: urban and rural communities. Then we have agricultural activities, and thirdly, livestock activities. The evaluation took place in 2 river basins. First, the Acero River Basin. The second basin is the Guadalquivir Basin. What are the characteristics of each one of these river basins? In the Acero Basin, we have a large surface area, 5,700 square kilometers, with 180 different communities. And the main difficulty here is water scarcity combined with poverty. For the Guadalquivir River Basin, it's a smaller land area, 3,300 square kilometers, 167 communities. And the main issue here is water scarcity and water pollution. Now, water pollution is something that aggravates the problem of water scarcity because the water resources available are not of sufficient quality for many of the activities that people rely on the basin for. What are the sources of data and information? First, public institutions through their official websites. There was no cost in collecting this data. For the hazard indicators, they came from the National Meteorological and Hydrological Service. And for most of the indicators, we got information from the National Institute of Statistics through two centers, one on population and communities, and the other one on agricultural activities. And then another source was the Ministry of Development Planning, and in particular, its data on poverty. So as I already said, we were focusing on 3 risk components and hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. Because of what we're talking about this afternoon, I'm going to be focusing on the indicators for water excess. Now, for the communities, the water excess hazard is the sum of precipitation that exceeds the 90th percentile. Just to remind you of this, according to the IPCC, any precipitation level that goes beyond the 90th percentile can be considered to be an extreme weather event. Now, since we're talking about different timeframes, what the indicator will show us is the sum of all of the extreme weather events in which we had high precipitation levels. The indicator for exposure is the population in the area, and the vulnerability indicator is poverty, defined as unsatisfied basic needs. When it comes to risk component indicators for agricultural activities, the risk component for hazard is the same. That is the sum of the precipitation that exceed the 90th percentile. It's the same thing that we did for inhabited communities. And this is due to the fact that the indicator of hazard is not a function of what is exposed to that risk. And when it comes to exposure, the element is the indicator relies on agricultural area. And for vulnerability, we have an indicator of sensitivity to water excess and 2 for adaptability. And that comprises the forested area, the number of farm tractors, in order to indicate the degree of farm mechanization in each one of the farming communities. And as you can see in the picture, there isn't a lot of mechanized farming in the river basins. And the number of pest control equipment, this is a way of measuring how much equipment they have for pest control, and then the number of people dedicated to farming in the community. It's important to underscore the fact that for exposure and vulnerability, the main activities, or for livestock activities, the exposure is calculated in the number of productive units. This comes from our livestock farm census. And as we mentioned, the hazard risk component is the same as in the other 2 cases for the same reasons. The exposure is the number of productive units raising livestock. And lastly, the indicator of vulnerability gives us an indicator of animal sensitivity to water excess, and then 2 indicators based on adaptability. Now, the results achieved. First of all, we got tabular and geographic information that shows us, for example, for the Guadalquivir River Basin, which is the one that you can see on the screen right now. Of the 167 communities in this Guadalquivir River Basin, they've all been ranked on the basis of the risk involved. For example, you can see the water excess risk on this map for the present moment, and then in the future as well. We've done it for some of the sub-river basins for the 73 different sub-units, which include the Guadalquivir River Basin and all of its tributaries. Now, all of the information has made it possible for us to develop recommendations for adaptation measures. We've also managed to develop a system for monitoring and evaluation, and we've also developed a training program on how this methodology can be used. All of the information generated in this evaluation has been transferred to the information system of the Strategic River Basin Plan. And in this Strategic River Basin Plan, not only will the definitions for the different components be taken on board, but this will focus not just on climate risks. There will also be references to things such as the quality of the water resources, the quantity of water resources available, issues such as biodiversity, agricultural productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the interesting things about this system, because it helps for decision makers in having a multi-criteria basis for making their decisions. It also has hyperlinks for these different indicators and the name of the contact person. Now, what are the lessons we've learned? First, by using the GIZ methodology and using census data, it was possible to identify the settlements that are at a high risk to climate change at a low cost and in a very short time frame. The second lesson we've drawn is that we were able to validate the data using the GIZ methodology and comparing it to the actual data in the river basin. And what we've seen is that there's a very good correlation between the data provided by the model and the data that we found in empirical observations. The GIZ methodology also uses the weighted arithmetic mean for calculating the risk, as you saw in the mathematical formula I showed you on another slide. One of the advantages of this is that it's very simple, but the disadvantage is that a positive value of one component may conceal the fact that the value of another component is at a critically low level. And this is a problem that always arises whenever using a weighted arithmetic mean or any average. And this happens to all in all mathematical formula used. The fourth lesson we've learned is that we will be carrying out a climate risk assessment again when we get new census data. And that will be available in 2024, we anticipate in any event. And lastly, in this first assessment that we carried out, we were able to establish a scale of risk degrees, high, medium, or low, based on the natural Jenks classification method. And in the future, it could be done using threshold values in the monitoring system. So by identifying high risk settlements or communities, we'll be able to use these threshold values. And then this last slide, I'm showing it to you so you can see some of the links where you can go and see the outputs and also the activities carried out by GIZ in Bolivia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Ingeniero. And many thanks to you and to your co-author, Carlos Saavedra. And so we are going to, I have lots of questions, and I'm starting to see in the Q&A section lots of other questions for you, but we're going to save the questions for the discussion section after the next talk. So again, our thanks. And with that, we're going to move a little to the north to Guayaquil, Ecuador, and to a somewhat different environment, in this case, a delta. So we've been working in some other kinds of areas, and now we're going to see what Guayaquil looks like. And Luis Domínguez Granda, he's a professor at the Escuela Superior Politécnica del Litoral, or ESPOL, it's called, the university. And he's been working in the water sector for 15 years, very active, a founding member of the IWA, what is that, International Water Association in Ecuador. And he directs the Center for Water and Sustainable Development in ESPOL. And he is working together with a water management agency. So that's going to make this very interesting indeed. So Dr. Domínguez Grande, if you can get us going here. Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. Good morning or good afternoon. Mónica Menendez from the city of Guayaquil. We've put together a project in some small part of the city of Guayaquil. We've implemented this project thanks to Dutch cooperation and thanks also to the participation of the illustrious municipality of Guayaquil. The project was carried out in the framework of an international framework with Dutch institutions, as well as my own university, ESPOL in Guayaquil. And today's presentation will be walking you through the decisions taken to face climate change in a delta city with its own specificities, i.e. the city of Guayaquil. And we'll discuss also the possible avenues for cooperation with various agencies. To begin the presentation, it's clear that many cities in the world today are threatened by floods. And it's just as clear that these floods give rise to substantial economic loss and also loss of human life in some circumstances. And this affects not just the public in general and the private sector, but it also affects the public institutions. And very often, we don't actually take into consideration the overall impact of these floods. We underestimate that. The number of houses that have been destroyed, personal property destroyed, but also loss of various services, like, for instance, health and education. What is abundantly clear is that over the past few years, the impact of all of this has been growing because of climate change. So we've tried to focus our presentation on delta cities. Why delta cities? Because they have some specificities of their own. These cities are threatened by two major factors. One of them is the increase in the seawater level. These are cities that are situated at the mouth of rivers and therefore influenced by the tide. And there's also a second factor, a change in the precipitation patterns, particularly where intensity is concerned, greater intensity of late, and also duration, which means that there's a particular impact on these delta cities, because these cities were established hundreds of years ago, and they have been developing in order to cope with some specific climate conditions. However, these conditions are now changing, and therefore the pressure is greater on these cities, and they're being subjected to conditions that they were not built for instance, inadequate stormwater drainage systems. And when we speak of management in many of our cities, and particularly in Latin America, when we speak of floods and flood management, we think of traditional structural ways. This is the way, traditional way in which people have been coping with floods. We've seen this particularly from the viewpoint of civil engineering. You know, there's a problem, excess of water, and that water has to be taken elsewhere, and therefore you build derivation, you build canals, you build stormwater drainage systems. But it's not enough. We have to have a multi-layered approach. We have to have the participation of the local people as well. Getting involved the people, not just the companies in charge of water management, but getting the traffic authority, the urban planners, those responsible for green areas, all of them cooperating together in a multi-layered approach with several objectives aimed at the same time in a participatory project involving several agencies responsible for the city. Now, my presentation will be focusing on the parish of Febres Cordero. This is chosen as a pilot area for the project. And it's got some specificities. One of them is that it is one of the most densely populated areas in the city, with around 360,000 inhabitants in some 15 square kilometers, under tremendous influence of the subestuaries, the salted subestuaries. So I was talking about the Febres Cordero parish, one of the three most densely populated areas in the city, with around 365,000 people, 15 square kilometers, surrounded by bodies of water, and therefore completely flood prone, particularly when there's heavy rainfall and when there's an increase in the level of the sea level rise. We used the CRIDA methodology that was proposed by UNESCO, developed by UNESCO. We carried out a whole working cycle, beginning with the establishment of the decision-making context, i.e., reaching an agreement among the stakeholders as to what is the future that we're all aiming at. What is our ambition there? The vulnerabilities of the system, the threats on the system, the hazards weighing on the system, so as to come up with climate-sensitive solutions. And the alternatives are based on the amount of information and data available. And then there's a very important part that Monica will be coming in later on how to institutionalize all of this. So the starting point of our project was to identify the participants, the stakeholders, who is going to be taking part in all this, but with a wide-ranging vision, not just a matter of getting water from point A to point B. So who is responsible for information? Who collects data? Who is responsible for water management? Who takes decisions on green areas? Who takes decision on traffic, on urban development, et cetera, et cetera? And then we carried out an analysis of the whole of the problem. Why are there floods? Why do they take place? Is it really because of rainwater? Is it because of the tides? And we take into account also other typical things in Latin America. For instance, the whole subject of the waste disposal, the waste disposal problem, particularly solid waste. So the idea was to define a common vision. And this is a multi-stakeholder participatory project. And through workshops, we managed to identify the preferences of the community. We know that the community for many years have had a number of fair to middling solutions, whereas we want to come up with really innovative solutions. So the first point is to get the institutions and the communities to accept new solutions and new changes. Well, the response was rather positive. And we identified the institutions involved in traffic and urban planning, also the availability of these participants to new solutions. And very interesting thing was identifying the limits of tolerance, the threshold of tolerance, because we must be aware that a city which is totally dry and which is flood-free would be very expensive to reach, would be a very expensive proposition. And this is why you have to put your heads together with the various institutions and the people involved. What level of cost are we ready to accept in order to bring about some kind of reasonable flood management? And then also, we must evaluate the threat, evaluate the hazard. So with our Dutch colleagues, we developed a flood model, including some key factors like the characteristics of the soil, precipitation levels, tidal levels, so as to be able to simulate the response of the system to the flood return times, flood conditions under different sea conditions, under different rainfall conditions, etc. And so we were able to develop flood maps under a variety of conditions, under different levels, under different recurrence intervals, etc., different scenarios. Take into account all the historical data that's always been used, obviously, for the development of rainwater drainage systems. So we looked at the past, at the historical data, but we also looked at the future. It's uncertain. However, we dared to include in our model events of high rise of sea level, greater intensity of rainfall, etc. All of this made it possible to generate impact. Indicators as to the level of water in the streets, the extension of this water level in the streets, the duration of these events in our cities. To this, we added the necessity to get information on the vulnerability of the community at large. So we carried out a lot of survey work, because as you know, very often in Latin America, you don't have enough information on the impact of floods. Very little information as to the actual physical impact. Which were the areas that were flooded? What was the extension of the flood? How long the flood lasted? There's not enough data about this, and also what the economic losses were, both in the public and the private sector. So in our project, we decided to get this information, get this data through surveys in the various trades, in the community in general. What is the impact that the population felt it had had? And what was the economic impact that they felt that they had had because of the floods? And the next step after that was identifying the solutions. When all is said and done, what can we say about this common future that we want to have access to? A better, more reasonably managed solution-based system. And this is, you have to take into account the dynamics of this sector, where the three factors that we took into consideration. First of all, it's a very important trade area with a tremendous amount of road traffic, a lot of people going through. And this is an area also that involves both the urban and the peripheral areas, residential areas, both in the center and around the edges of the parish. So it was necessary to take into account all of these various factors so as to implement solutions that would be nature-based with a gradual strategy, introducing the community to the necessary changes little by little, getting the institutions involved little by little around three alternatives, using nature-based solutions that you find today, however, which cannot just be implemented overnight. They have to be socialized, they have to be integrated, there has to be a sense of ownership on the part of the community, because they will be able to see that these nature-based solutions will yield good results. These are multi-objective solutions. Obviously, it's not just managing floods. Another objective is also getting a better environment, getting better air quality, better quality of life for the population at large. So this step-by-step approach leads to a combination of nature-based solutions, which were finally presented to the community. The community got information as to what was going to be the reduction of the levels, extension, and frequency of the floods, and also information on the levels of the reduction of economic losses, which is obviously of particular interest to the institutions. And before I ask Monica to join me here to tell us institutionally how the municipality reacted to this, let me tell you about a pilot area in a residential zone in the lower left-hand side of the slide. You reach the levels of flood with a return period of 10 years. And at the time at which we actually intervened here, or we said that we would intervene with better permeable paving of the streets, more green areas, and you can see how the level and the intensity is reduced of a flood. And then intervention B is a more aggressive type of approach with more green areas, better materials used for the paving the streets, more permeable, and we were able to reduce both the levels, the extension, and the intensity of flooding in this sector. And now Monica will tell us about how the institutions were reacting to all of this. Monica, hello everyone, can you all hear me? My name is Monica Mendez from the city of Guayaquil. I'm an advisor on urban planning, and I wanted to tell you about the fact that this project was part and parcel of an overall strategy. Guayaquil, as you know, is part of the network of resilient cities. And we were working within the framework of this particular project. And a number of agencies of the United Nations have been supporting us in this endeavor. Now here, the work that we carry out obviously in cooperation with all of these agencies, but with a particular focus on the city of Guayaquil and the institutions of Guayaquil. And so here, what we have to take into account is the fact that we need short, medium, and long-term planning, a short, medium, and long-term planning vision as well, in which the various institutions of the city would participate in order better to adapt to climate change. So what happens in an urban context, in a city such as ours, with a tremendous amount of transient population, people who actually come into the city for work, but they actually live there. They live around Guayaquil, in the greater Guayaquil area, so to say. So obviously, we needed a vision to encompass all of this, take into account the specificities of the city, particularly where the floods are concerned, and the so-called gray solutions that we had in the past, with which people were very dissatisfied. So what needed to be done was to get the institutions involved with a very strong commitment on the part of the local government to make sure that nobody would be left out, that it would be an all-out effort. And not just that particular parish that my colleague was telling you about, but it's a whole citywide effort at different levels, cultural, social, economic, with the various institutions at each of these levels involved, with an overall view, an overall vision in which the citizen is the most important stakeholder and is in fact the aim of the whole project. The aim is to satisfy the citizenry, and meet the needs of the citizenry, particularly in this urban, flood-prone context. And this has been a tremendous challenge to us. Now, obviously, the project constantly was supported by the municipality from the very beginning, bringing about participation of all the stakeholders, not just at the end, but from the very beginning and throughout the project. The very methodology required this type of participatory approach, because in our cities, we live very often on a day-to-day basis. On the day-to-day business of the city, there are very many people involved, many stakeholders involved, and we need to get them all within this so as to be able to make sure that whatever solutions are suggested at the end are accepted, not just tolerated, but accepted by the community with a sense of ownership. The local government, therefore, wants structural green measures to be adopted, which will be meant to satisfy the greater needs of the population. And as a consequence of this joint effort, in which various institutions have been taken part, I beg your pardon, we need then to make sure that this is part and parcel of our planning for the future, for the medium and the long term. So what does that mean where a local government is concerned? That means that we, representatives of the local government, will be able to keep in touch with those responsible for public works, those who are responsible for drinking water access, those who are responsible for the social and economic cultural needs of the citizenry, of the various municipal institutions and structures, the NGOs also present must be part of this effort. And so today we're now finalizing the operation because we're now building this plan for the future. And when we speak about building this plan, what we mean is we want to have clear lines, clear investment lines. We need to have to carry out a certain number of studies, obviously, but these studies will not just be theoretical, but will have a practical edge to them, will lead to the actual solutions that will be recommended at the end. I think that I've run out of time, but I'm quite sure that there'll be other questions put to us, and we'll be able to give you more information about this collective effort in which the municipality of Guayaquil is taking a full part. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you Ms. Menendez, I didn't have a bio for you, but you did a very good job of expressing who you are and the importance of engaging with the municipality to have the combination of the academic side and the engagement of the municipality and your stakeholders. So thank you to both of you for that. And with that, we will pass to the next section, which is our discussion section. We have lots of questions already in our question and answer boxes, but we can certainly have some more. I'd like to get it started with a question that was asked by several people, and that would be of the first speakers. You referred to the communities in the area, but people were curious, how did you learn about the needs of the area? How did you speak with the stakeholders and involve them in the process? Thank you.
Ya, muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Well, thank you very much for that question. The involvement and participation of the stakeholders that live in the river basis is something that we wanted to activate early on. And we showed you that in the diagram. We showed you the very first step in developing the strategic river basin plan. I mentioned the development of an institutional platform. What is that? Well, it's actually a combination or a collection of all of the people who live and work in the river basin. That also comprises representatives of people representing regional government agencies and national government agencies. Now, they can still nonetheless work in a bottom-up approach in developing a model and an approach for assessing climate risks. Now, one of the most important features of what I've seen, and this is unfortunate in my view, is that in many cases, local perceptions have prevailed over scientific or objective data. A lot of these assessments perhaps rely excessively on people's impressions of climate events and their impact, rather than relying more on objective data. That's what we've tried to do in our case study, and to draw on both sources of information. We had participation from the local population in developing our diagnosis and in collecting data. And what's important is that this is an input to the strategic plan for the river basin, and it's at that level that all the decisions will be made. Carlos, do you have anything that you would like to add? Thank you, Jose. And thank you to those who've raised that question, and also thanks to all the panelists. Perhaps what I could add when I speak about the scope of the work that we've been involved in assessing climate risks, and this is related to ProCuenca, which is an integrated river basin management project in Bolivia. And the idea here is to promote the integrated management of high water resources in order to achieve water security. In these two specific case studies in the Azero and Guadalquivir River basins, we wanted to do this in such a way to come up with an institutional framework for the integrated management of both of these river basins, and also with a lot of input from the national government. And this is something that draws on the national river basin management plan, with different milestones that have to be achieved in order to promote and consolidate water security. The evaluation of a climate risk is something that's a cross-sectoral exercises. We have to look not just at the current risks, but future risks. And an important part of this entire process is that it's enabled us to identify the most appropriate adaptation measures to cope with occasional floods and occasional droughts, and to give priorities to certain areas, for example, preserving water resources for areas in the natural environment that are under particular stress, protection of people living on the river banks, etc. But above all, what we want to do is have a sound analysis of the needs. And that really is where we try to have a mix of structural solutions and non-structural solutions, and based on the notion of shared responsibility at local level. So risk assessment is part of all of this. And this methodology has enabled us to have a more adaptable and flexible way of coping with the climate risks. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think that was very helpful for understanding how the stakeholders plug into the process here. Now I have a question that, and I say I have a question. This reflects the discussion. How are the water managers in both these cases, both the Guayaquil case and the Bolivian cuencas, the watersheds and basins, are the water managers in the area, either for the cities or the provinces or states, is this something that they were familiar with, these kinds of approaches, before you got involved in this project, or was this something fairly new? And perhaps Ms. Menendez and Luis Dominguez can help us start that discussion.
Yes, thank you. In the case of Guayaquil, we were also working on a strategy in an urban environment, drawing on local, working with local community leaders in order to manage the risks. So, as I said, we already had some experience on working on a proposal for an urban environment, and this was the construction of risk management committees at the community level. Yeah, this was a real challenging, because we always find differences from one committee to another, because they all represent different districts in the city. But in a neighborhood like Padre Escobedo, we came up with some specific guidelines and specific ways of organizing our communities. And this had an impact on planning and also the socialization of some of the urban construction projects. Now, the way in which the data was collected and the information was gathered was quite new, quite innovative. We tried to understand people's views, as Luis was saying, by trying to hear their own perceptions. And what we saw was a great variety of views, even going from one neighborhood to another, because independently of things like flooding or heavy rains or high tide events, which leads to flooding in parts of the city, people don't always have the same perception of the risks or the impact. We don't see the same behavior. So there's no denying that this is something where each individual community and sector got involved but they didn't necessarily provide us with the answers we were looking for. But they at least got us on the right track. So what we had to do was really go down to a kind of a micro level and come up with decisions that would garner more and more support for what we were doing, because we're talking about changing people's everyday behavior. People's behavior had to change for the change to actually happen as well. Thank you. Thank you, William, for that question as well. I think in the case of Bolivia, one of the realities that we have to contend with is the German Watch Institute's report on the index of global climate risks. And Bolivia is ranked 10th in terms of recurring climate events. And so it was dire indeed. And it was urgent that we come up with concrete measures to reduce our vulnerability. And so this was a long-standing process. And it has two parts. First of all, risk management, which is defined by the Ministry of Defense. And the second aspect has to do with the management of our water resources programs. And the national government has defined its plan in the strategic plan, which was first put together in 2007. So we decided to focus on river basins as the focal point for the management of our water resources and the assessment and management of risks. And that's what we've seen in this case study in the two river basins we looked at this afternoon. Now, the master plan for river basins is the tool that we use for implementing all of the policies that we develop for urban centers or for other areas where water resources are used. It's something that's called on a coordinated and interdependent effort of all of the actors involved and all the stakeholders, not just local governments, but local communities, etc. It's this approach that's going to make it possible in the future to have a sounder approach to managing water resources and to provide for water security on the basis of our assessed climate risks today and in the future. And for this, it's very important for the policy to be tied in with territorial planning. We do this by tying it in with the nationwide economic development plan, the sectoral integrated management programs for air pollution, for water resources, etc. So it's a process that involves many different stakeholders. The governance process, I would say, is still something that's emerging. We need to come up with a set of clear standards in order to make the entire system more robust, and also to come up with a water management board, as it were, that would make it possible for us to ensure that the decisions and policies are implemented, and then to be able to evaluate that on the basis of input from all of the stakeholders.
Very interesting answers, and always good to see engineers and scientists engaged with the stakeholders. I have two slightly more technical questions that have been raised by participants, and let me start first with the Guayaquil study. The question is, you mentioned in working with local residents a threshold of tolerance. I think in Spanish those were límites de tolerancia to floods, for example. How did you get to those thresholds or limits? How were they defined, and is that qualitative or quantitative? Thank you.
En el caso de Guayaquil,
Well, in the case of Guayaquil, because of the different workshops we organized, we had three key indicators that emerged: the level of water, the extension of the flooding, and for how long was that area flooded. So in our workshops with the communities, we would first of all socialize with them and help them understand that a city that's completely dry is something that would be impossible to achieve on a permanent basis in a city like Guayaquil. So the idea is, what would you be willing to accept? And so once we start talking about rising water levels, a lot of people would say, well, as long as it doesn't reach my house, everything's fine. I mean, I can deal with water in the street as long as it doesn't get into my street. And in our streets, we have curbs that are 15 to 20 centimeters high. So people will be willing to put up with 20 centimeters of water in the streets, but not higher than that. Now, in other communities, they have other problems. For example, you start talking about people using mass transit, people using buses. If the water level is 30 or 40 centimeters high, then the buses have to stop. But if it's only 5 to 10 centimeters deep, or even up to 50 centimeters deep, that will slow down traffic, but cars and buses can still make it through the city. Now, if we talk about how much surface area is flooded, some people might think, okay, well, if there's only one city block that's flooded, that's fine. But if it's 3 or 4, it's too much. So it's this qualitative appreciation, but with quantitative measurements. We also asked some questions about frequency. How many times would you be willing to put up with this? And they say, if it's 3 or 4 times in a year, that's tolerable. 20 centimeters of water in the street for 3 or 4 times in a year is not a big deal. And a flood that only lasts for 1 hour, that's tolerable for them. So that was the type of question and answer process that we started coming up with these thresholds or these limits of tolerance.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. A related question, I believe, is for our friends in Bolivia. How did you come up with the vulnerability indicators? This seems like a related question to me. Was this through engagement with the cities, with the agricultural communities? How did those evolve? Thank you.
Yeah, gracias. Los indicadores que se han utilizado.
Thank you for the question. The indicators that we used were identified and selected based on the information that is available from the census. The census on urban communities and farming communities. We did this in order to bring down the whole cost of the exercise, because every time I go out and try to gather data, raw data, it takes a long time and involves considerable costs. So since this type of information was already available free of charge, was that we looked at that data, and the indicators of exposure and vulnerability should be aligned with the information that's available in the census data. So that was our basic approach, in order not to have to generate additional information at additional cost. Let me just round out that answer by saying that the basis for the development of indicators is very important, because it ties right into the chain of impacts. And we prioritized some of the hazards, flooding and drought, for example. And if we talk about drought or too much precipitation, well, one indicator might be the number of days where precipitation was higher than a certain level. And when we talk about exposure, we used indicators that would give us an idea of the factors that come into play. For example, the number of people living in a given square kilometer who are exposed to the risk of flooding, and the elements of critical infrastructure that could also be under threat or at risk because of flooding. So by drawing on the perceptions of stakeholders and also drawing on this type of quantitative data, we get both factors, qualitative and quantitative, in coming up with these indicators. So we work with technical staff and also with decision makers at local level. And it's on the basis of all this data that we can come up with the most appropriate adaptive measures to address the risks that we've analyzed. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. as we approach the 15-minute mark left, there was a question from the participants. Oh, which are the main aspects or teachings of in the application of CRIDA to both river basins, and can you provide a summary of the CRIDA methodology? So I think the best person to answer this might be Luis Dominguez, who is specifically applying the CRIDA methodology, which is climate risk-informed decision analysis. And CRIDA in general, it is an approach to integrating climate, the climate stressors, along with other stresses that engineers and planners might find. So the approach of CRIDA it's bottom up, right? It can meet in the middle with for example, downscaling of climate models and things like that, the hydrometeorological and hydroclimatological side of things. But it really starts at the bottom with the kinds of issues that our speakers have talked about, which is what, of all the problems, what is it that keeps the water managers awake at night? What does Miss Monica Menendez think about when she wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning? What are the problems that she sees? But perhaps, Luis, would you like to address that? How you incorporated CRIDA into your project?
Sí, tal vez algo muy breve para darle oportunidad a Mónica.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I want Monica to pitch in as well. CRIDA made it possible for us to carry out a well-organized process using the very latest tools, computational models in order to work on these future climate change scenarios over and beyond what is run-of-the-mill, where the engineers come with a return period based on historical data, which is what I was mentioning before. You go beyond that. CRIDA also made it possible to get around the same table stakeholders from society at large, from the community at large, and from institutions. In other words, this kind of thing is not just to be looked at from engineering, from a civil engineering viewpoint, but it's something that must be dealt with through a multi-layered, multi-dimensional participatory process where you're seeking solutions that will work out for everybody and not just for a few. That is precisely what CRIDA enables. And through information, decisions can be taken in a much better way. Monica, over to you. Well, yes. I think it is important to have historical data, obviously. You need to know what happened in the years past. What has been the reaction of the institutions and the people in the past. So it is this participation of the various stakeholders, the various actors that will make it possible not just to find the solutions, but to find viable solutions, acceptable solutions. Because the thing is, once you get the operation going, once you're using public resources for a particular number of plants that are going to be implemented, once you get municipalities involved, that is not enough. You need also society at large to show interest in this, because this takes a long time. You're in this for the long haul. So the population has got to be convinced. And even though you don't see immediately the fruits of all of this labor, it will come in the end. So this is a kind of steadfast work where everybody must pitch in, everybody must be involved, academia, the universities, the citizenry at large, the community, Obviously, the public sector, whether you're talking about national public sector or more local public sector, but that's got to be the vision. That's got to be the line you take, particularly when we're talking about very scarce economic resources available for this kind of thing. So that is one of the most important things where methodology is concerned. Incorporating, involving all of these stakeholders within one single vision. The finality and the objective being finding viable solutions that will be implementable.
Thank you very much to you. I have one more question, and then I believe we'll have to wrap it up. But to the Bolivian folks, what's the next step now that you've learned a lot about the risk within what's actually a fairly large, several large basins? What would be the next steps, and who is interested in working with you on those next steps? Thank you.
Gracias, William, por la pregunta. Creo que el
Thank you,
análisis
William, for your question. I think that climate risk analysis opens up tremendous prospects, particularly in using this type of analysis for the master plans for these river basins and the interaction between climate change and territorial and sectoral planning. And in this area, we've been working with the Environment and Water Ministry in developing a study on climate risk from both a bottoms up and up approach and the opposite, so as to make sure that we get everybody involved, particularly in the south of Bolivia and in the Amazon area of Bolivia as well, very close to the area of Chiquitaca, where we had the most devastating forest fires in 2019, 2020. So the idea is to get involved all of these various sectors. So let's try to make sure that everybody gets to see what are the prospects for good climate risk adaptation and what the adaptation measures have got to be taken on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis, which will mean that we will have measures that are much more nature-based, measures with sustainable farming, sustainable livestock activities, etc. Key factors would make it possible to ensure water security in these areas that are being affected, particularly by water stress, as incredible as that may sound. And also making sure that climate risk analysis is part and parcel of a whole information system. The level of the basin to help in decision making, where climate risk adaptation will become an important factor in decision making, thereby contributing to strategic decision taken as regards the management of groundwater, particularly surface and groundwater management. This is what the country is aiming at with the new master plan for our river basins by the year 2025.
Reminding us, all of you, that it's all about making decisions. It's not just about the science and the engineering and the history. It's about making good water resources decisions with all the inputs we have. And with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Anil Mishra from UNESCO in Paris, looking like he's actually found his way to his office in the beautiful 16th arrondissement. Anil?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Will, for moderating this session. And I would like to, first of all, thank two speakers who really presented very interesting case studies on this, our series of webinar climate resilient water management approaches, adaptation in an age of uncertainty, the 6th webinar with case studies from South America, enhancing urban water resilience, bringing case studies from Colombia and Bolivia and Ecuador. So thank you very much, Joshua Luis and Luis Domingo and Monica for presenting the bottom-up approaches. The idea of this webinar when we started series to compile case studies, but we also would like to organize a global conference where all these case study compiled will be presented. So this is an ongoing process. We have exceeded today the 6th one, and I'm not going to repeat what you have said, but it seems very relevant as the Miguel in his opening remarks said it's one of the most urbanized continent, and the topic that we have chosen, urban water resilience with the bottom of approaches, particularly CRIDA. And I'm also very pleased to announce that following this particular webinar, we are going to have a LAC CRIDA training course soon implemented for the LAC region. Of course, we are doing training program for other region as well, but for the Latin America and Caribbean. So this will be also sort of a follow-up of the activities that we've been doing with our partner ICIWaRM, the Will Logan director who moderated, and AGWA, Alex, who was behind the scene, but really helping to organize not only this webinar, but also all the seminar that we've been doing. And in our joint effort, he already mentioned in the chat room that we have published a policy brief and video which was shown in the beginning as well. And I would like to call upon participants to follow our webinar, and we plan to have a global conference on climate resilient water management approaches in October prior to the COP26. So follow us on our announcement both in UNESCO website, but also AGWA and ICIWaRM. And this webinar is also available, including the video sessions in our website. So with that, I would like to thank again the speakers and the panelists, but also I would like to particularly thank co-organizer ICIWaRM, Will Logan, the director, John Matthew and Alex and the team from AGWA, and my team from the section here, Hydrological System and Water Scarcity, Barbara, Kabuma, Hong, Rita, Lucille. They really were working behind the scene to make this happen. And particularly, I would also like to pay tribute to Patricia. For her, it will be sort of a final webinar as she will move on to another horizon. I wish her all the best. And you might have received email from her in many of the previous seminar. So I wish Patricia all the best for her future endeavor. And thank you very much. And we will meet you on the 7th series of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, translators.
Yes, thank you, interpreters, Alexandra and whole team. Yes, Will, thank you for reminding. Yeah, thank you very much.